A millionaire marries a homeless girl until Christmas Eve. When the church bells ring, the girl is holding hands with another man. The private club buzzed with a low hum of privilege. Crystal glasses clinked, and laughter, deep and hollow, spilled over velvet banquettes. Daniel Montgomery sat slouched on a leather chair, a glass of scotch dangling lazily between his fingers. Brandon Evans's voice rang out, cutting through the air with a sharp edge of amusement. "You're bored, Montgomery," Brandon taunted, flipping his wrist dismissively, as if Daniel's very existence exhausted him. "Admit it. You lack purpose and enjoyment, akin to a dog pursuing its tail." Daniel's lips curled into a faint smile. He didn't argue. Brandon wasn't wrong. Despite its decadence, the world felt incredibly thin these days. Every party, every deal, every woman melted into the same flavorless monotony. "And what's your point, Brandon?" Brandon grinned, the predator's kind of grin. "I'll make you a bet. Since you're so fearless, how about marrying someone from the bottom of the barrel? Let's say, a homeless woman. Stick it out till Christmas, and I'll hand you $1 million, just for the effort." The other men chuckled, shaking their heads as though it were all a farcical joke. Brandon poured more champagne and leaned back smugly. Daniel tilted his head, something cold settling in his chest. A beat passed. "Fine." The laughter stuttered, then stopped entirely. Brandon blinked. "You're serious?" Daniel stood and straightened the cuffs of his shirt. "You wanted to see if I could, didn't you?" He threw a careless smirk at the group before walking away, but as he stepped out into the biting wind of Manhattan, the humor faded from his face like fog off glass. Manhattan wore its usual cloak of indifference, grime glossed over with neon lights, the occasional siren slicing through the evening hum. Daniel strode down the streets, hands shoved into the pockets of his overcoat, his polished shoes tapping on damp concrete. He stopped in front of an old marquee, its paint chipped and forgotten. Beneath it, a figure sat, hunched but not broken, her form outlined against the dirty brick wall. She wasn't begging. There was no sign, no cup of coins. Just a backpack beside her and a notebook balanced carefully on her knees. She wrote with intent, as though nothing else mattered, her pen scraping faintly over the paper. Daniel hesitated before stepping closer. The sound of his approach made her pause, her eyes lifting, sharp, blue, and unyielding. They took him by surprise. He'd expected something duller, maybe desperate. Instead, she watched him like she was already preparing to tell him no. "Are you here to kick me out?" Her voice was steady, tinged with dry indifference. "No." Daniel crouched, ignoring the damp chill of the ground. "I have a proposition." She stared at him for a long moment before snorting softly. Proposition? From a guy in a $1,000 coat." "It's, unconventional," he admitted. Her gaze flicked over him, unimpressed. Up close, he noticed the worn edges of her fingers and ink stains on the sides. She had a way of sitting, straight-backed still, that reminded him of someone used to holding their ground. "Keep talking," she said finally, but the sharp look in her eye made it clear this wasn't an invitation to waste her time. "I want you to marry me." She blinked once, twice, before tilting her head back and laughing, a quiet, bitter sound that made Daniel shift slightly. "You're joking." "I'm not." She closed the notebook and rested it on her lap, her fingers drumming lightly against the cover. "Do I look stupid to you?" "No," Daniel said, his voice soft but firm. "You don't." "Then explain it to me," she shot back. "Why does a guy like you need a wife like me?" Daniel hesitated. The words stuck in his throat, the truth too absurd to say out loud. "I have my reasons." "That's not good enough." He exhaled, his breath misting in the cold. "Look, I'm not asking you to love me. It's an arrangement. temporary. You get a place to stay, food, whatever you need. At Christmas we part ways and you walk away with something. She studied him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hiss of passing cars. Then she said quietly, "What's in it for you?" Daniel didn't answer right away. The wind tugged at the hem of his coat, but he didn't feel it. Finally, he replied, "That doesn't concern you." Her lips pressed together, her fingers tightening on the notebook. "And if I say no?" "Then you say no," Daniel replied. "I'll leave you alone." Mary's shoulders tensed slightly as she weighed his words. The thought of leaving the streets for a while, of warmth, of food she didn't have to fight for, lingered at the edges of her thoughts, like a ghost. But she wasn't naive. "All right," she said finally, her voice clipped. "But here's the deal. I'm not your puppet. I'll live there, I'll wear your stupid ring, but I won't change who I am. When it's over, I walk away, and you owe me nothing." Daniel nodded once, rising to his feet. "Done." Mary watched him for a beat longer before picking up her bag and tucking the notebook away. She stood, her chin raised like someone daring the world to challenge her. "This is the dumbest thing I've ever agreed to," she muttered. Daniel didn't reply. Instead, he gestured towards the street, his face as inscrutable as hers. "Let's go." And just like that, the deal was struck. Two strangers walking into something that neither of them understood, their steps swallowed by the vast indifference of the city. The drive to Long Island was soundless, save for the occasional hum of tires over uneven asphalt. Mary sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed tightly, her face turned toward the window. The glow of city lights faded behind them, replaced by sprawling darkness, punctuated by the distant glow of mansions hidden behind iron gates. Daniel, hands firm on the wheel, glanced at her only once. She didn't meet his eyes. Her reflection in the glass was sharper than it should have been, eyes cold, mouth a hard line, as though preparing for something she wasn't sure she could face. When they pulled into the estate, the sheer size of the house sprawled before her, an expanse of stone and glass drenched in artificial light. Mary stepped out of the car, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Her breath fogged in the winter air as she took in the manicured gardens, the carved stone pillars framing the doorway, and the quiet hum of opulence. "Welcome home," Daniel said flatly, pulling the keys from his pocket. Mary didn't respond. She merely walked up the wide steps, trailing a step behind him as he pushed the heavy doors open. The interior of the mansion unfolded like a stage set, marble floors gleaming under chandeliers, tall windows trimmed in velvet, and art, grand, imposing, on every wall. Everything looked untouched, too perfect, like a museum curated for visitors who never came. Daniel set his coat on a side chair and turned to face her. She stood near the entrance, unmoving. Her eyes scanned the space, not in awe, but with a wary curiosity, like someone who had stumbled into enemy territory. "Your room is upstairs," Daniel said. "Third door on the left." She nodded but didn't move. Instead, her fingertips hovered briefly over the edge of a nearby table, mahogany, intricately carved, before pulling away. Daniel noticed the hesitation. "Oh, you're not going to break anything?" Mary looked at him, her face unreadable. "I know." She turned and walked slowly toward the staircase, her boots muffled against the runner. Daniel watched her disappear, a frown tugging at the edge of his mouth. For the first time, he wondered if he'd invited a ghost into his home. The following morning, sunlight poured through the mansion's floor-to-ceiling windows, spilling warmth onto rugs, too fine for shoes. Mary wandered through the halls in quiet solitude. She didn't move like a guest. She moved like an intruder. Her steps were careful and measured, as if each room might swallow her whole. She lingered near the library, the scent of leather-bound books pulling her in, but she didn't touch a single one. She passed a sunlit parlor where a piano sat idle, its black lacquer glistening like oil, and paused to stare at it for a long minute. In the kitchen, the staff offered her pastries and omelettes under silver domes. She declined. Instead, she grabbed a plain apple from a bowl and slipped outside into the garden. Daniel watched her from his office window. The apple, a token worth less than a single coin in his pocket, looked absurd in her hand against the backdrop of sprawling fountains and roses manicured into perfect symmetry. She perched herself under an oak tree, sitting cross-legged in the brittle grass, notebook open on her lap. Daniel knew she was writing. She always was. That night, long after the staff retired, Daniel wandered the halls out of restlessness. The house, vast and empty, felt even quieter with someone else living in it. As he passed a distant hallway, a faint sound reached him, a single note on the piano, low and off-key. Then another. He followed the sound toward the parlor, steps silent on the floor. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by the faint moonlight slipping through the windows. Mary sat on the bench before the piano, her back straight, shoulders still. Her fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant, testing them as if remembering something long forgotten. The instrument was old, its sound imperfect. A broken key let out a dull thud when pressed, and Mary stopped. Her shoulders dropped, and she let out a slow breath. "You play?" Daniel's voice broke the silence, soft but sudden. Mary tensed, her fingers curling into her lap. She didn't turn around. "It's nothing," she said. He stepped closer, hands in his pockets, watching her as she studied the keys. "Doesn't sound like nothing." Mary turned then, her eyes cold and sharp in the pale light. "Why are you here?" Daniel shrugged. "Couldn't sleep. Neither could you, apparently." She stood up, closing the piano lid with deliberate care. "It's late." "You didn't answer the question," he said, his voice quieter this time. "You play. Why?" Mary picked up her notebook, tucking it under her arm. "Some things don't belong to this place. Good night, Daniel." She brushed past him, leaving him alone in the dark room. Daniel turned to look at the piano. The broken key still sat crooked, mocking the silence she left behind. In the days that followed, Daniel learned to watch without asking. Mary roamed the mansion like it wasn't hers, and never would be, careful not to leave marks or memories. She moved quietly, wrote constantly, and ignored everything she couldn't understand. And Daniel, for reasons he didn't yet grasp, found himself waiting for her to play the piano again. The days blurred into a quiet rhythm, though it was far from harmonious. Mary existed like a shadow in the sprawling mansion, leaving little behind but faint echoes of her presence. She rose early, hours before Daniel stirred, and spent the mornings wandering the grounds. Her steps were soft, careful, like she feared any noise might remind her she didn't belong here. From his office window, Daniel often watched her. The gardens sprawled like a painting in perfect symmetry, but Mary always gravitated toward the messier, forgotten spaces, the overgrown ivy climbing the back trellis, the neglected stone bench near the fountain where leaves gathered. She would sit there, legs tucked beneath her, notebook balanced on her knees. The pen in her hand moved constantly, an extension of her thoughts. Daniel never asked what she was writing. Not yet. One morning, he left a steaming plate of breakfast on the counter, a small gesture. When he returned, it was untouched. A maid quietly informed him later that Mary had handed it over to the kitchen staff, insisting they eat it instead. "She's stubborn, sir," the maid offered cautiously, like it wasn't her place to comment. Daniel frowned, but said nothing. The phone call came late that evening. The mansion was shrouded in its usual silence, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace in Daniel's study. Brandon's voice erupted through the line like a burst of static, mocking, predictable. "Montgomery," Brandon drawled, the faint clinking of ice against glass in the background. "Don't tell me you're taking this bet too seriously. Found your perfect wife yet?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, rolling the crystal tumbler between his palms. His gaze flickered toward the hallway, empty as always. "It's started," he replied coolly. Brandon let out a bark of laughter. "Unbelievable. You actually did it? Who is she? A runaway heiress? Some charity case with good cheekbones?" Daniel's grip tightened on the glass. "She's no one you'd understand." "Oh, come on. Don't get sentimental on me, Daniel. Remember, you've got until Christmas. I know the terms." Daniel hung up before Brandon could respond, the echo of his voice still vibrating in the room. For the first time since the bet began, Daniel felt an unfamiliar discomfort settle in his chest, though he couldn't name it. Mary's room was a fortress. She kept the door closed, and Daniel respected the barrier, though his curiosity grew heavier with each passing day. When they crossed paths, usually in the hall or the kitchen, her responses were clipped and efficient. "You don't talk much, do you?" he asked once, after catching her slipping out with her notebook under her arm. Mary didn't pause. "You talk enough for both of us." One evening, Daniel found her in the library. She sat in the far corner, knees drawn up onto the armchair, a book open in her lap. But she wasn't reading. Her pen scratched relentlessly against the pages of her notebook, her brow furrowed in quiet concentration. "What do you write in there?" His voice startled her, the pen freezing mid-stroke. Mary looked up, her fingers curling around the edge of the notebook protectively, as if he'd tried to pry it from her hands. "It's none of your business," she said flatly. Daniel stepped closer, curiosity sharpening his tone. "It's all you ever do, writing, wandering, disappearing. You've been here for days, and I still don't know a single thing about you." "You know enough," Mary replied, closing the notebook with deliberate care. Her knuckles turned white against the spine, but her expression was unreadable. "You know I agreed to this arrangement. Isn't that all that matters?" "It isn't," Daniel said, though he wasn't sure why. The air between them hung heavy, strained. Daniel watched her, how tightly she held that notebook, like it was the last piece of herself she refused to let go of. Finally, Mary stood, tucking it under her arm. "Some things are mine," she said softly, her voice carrying an edge Daniel couldn't quite name. "And you don't get to take them." He didn't stop her as she brushed past him, her footsteps dissolving into silence. Later that night, Daniel wandered the parlor. The piano, silent and untouched since Mary's brief, haunting melody, sat under the moonlight, its broken key a quiet reminder of something unresolved. He pressed a few random notes, but the sound was hollow, off balance. Something about it irritated him. As he sat alone in the darkness, Daniel found himself thinking about Mary, how she moved like she was afraid of leaving traces behind, how she guarded her words as fiercely as she guarded that notebook. Her silence wasn't empty, he realized. It was filled with something he didn't yet understand, something that made him notice the small things. The way her hands trembled when someone got too close. The way she avoided looking anyone in the eye for too long. The way her shoulders relaxed, ever so slightly, when she sat outside in the cold, surrounded by nothing but her own company. And most unsettling of all, the sadness in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. Daniel turned away from the piano, restless. The house, vast and beautiful, had never felt more suffocating. Somewhere upstairs, he imagined Mary still writing, her pen scratching quietly against paper, filling pages with thoughts he couldn't read. for now at least. The morning began the way they all did. Mary in the garden, Daniel watching from his office window. She sat cross-legged on the cold stone bench, head bowed over her notebook, as if she could write herself invisible. But today, the quiet wouldn't last. A car engine hummed up the long driveway, tires crunching against gravel. Daniel turned sharply from the window, recognizing the sound before it stopped. Brandon Evans. "Daniel!" Brandon's voice boomed through the foyer, brash and unwelcome against the mansion's practiced calm. His overcoat flared dramatically as he stepped inside, his smile wide, as though he owned the place. "I thought you were dead. You don't answer my calls anymore." Daniel leaned against the stair rail, arms crossed. "What are you doing here?" "Checking on your little project." Brandon smirked, brushing past him toward the sitting room. "I've got to see this masterpiece of charity for myself." "She's not a project," Daniel muttered under his breath. But Brandon was already settling into the leather armchair, perfectly at ease. "Come on, Montgomery, don't be shy. Where is she? Still hiding out of shame, or are you too embarrassed to introduce me?" "Leave it, Brandon." The laughter died in Brandon's throat as Mary appeared in the doorway, unnoticed at first. She stood still, her presence almost ghostly in its quietness. Brandon, spotting her, turned his full attention to her, with a look that felt too much like appraisal. "So, this is her." His tone was light, too light, but his eyes were sharp. "Well, aren't you lucky, Daniel? A charity case with grit. They're hard to find these days." Mary froze. The words seemed to hang in the air like frost, sharp and cutting. Daniel straightened immediately, but the damage had been done. "Excuse me." Mary's voice was calm, but the tightness in it betrayed her. Daniel shot Brandon a warning glare. "Get out." Brandon only laughed, unfazed. "Relax, I'm kidding." He turned to Mary. "No offense, sweetheart. I simply find the entire journey from poverty to wealth admirable." Mary didn't reply. Her face remained blank, but something shifted in her posture, something brittle, fragile. Without a word, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Daniel with the unmistakable feeling that a crack had splintered deep. Daniel found her upstairs minutes later. The door to her room was open, and Mary stood by the bed, shoving clothes into her tattered backpack. Her movements were brisk, her breaths shallow. "You're leaving," Daniel said softly. Mary didn't look at him. "I knew this was a mistake." "It wasn't." She spun around, clutching the zipper of her bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I'm not welcome here, Daniel." "You don't need to reiterate that. I understand it clearly." "It wasn't me," Daniel said quickly, stepping forward. "That's Brandon. He's a—" "I don't care who he is," Mary snapped, her voice rising in sharp contrast to her usual calm. "I'm not a joke. I'm not a story you tell your friends for laughs. I didn't sign up to be your little charity experiment." Her hands trembled as she closed the zipper, the sound cutting through the tense silence like a blade. Daniel felt something twist in his chest as he watched her turn away, ready to walk out the door. "Wait," he said, voice cracking unexpectedly. "Please." She paused but didn't turn around. "I made a mistake." Daniel's voice softened, his words careful, deliberate. "The bet. It was a stupid game. But I swear, I'm not laughing anymore." Mary's shoulders stiffened. Slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes sharp, searching. "So what are you doing, Daniel? What is this?" Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know." The admission felt strange on his tongue, too raw and honest for someone who was used to lying smoothly through life. "I don't know what this is, but I know it's not a game anymore. Not for me." Mary's gaze held his, unflinching. The silence between them stretched, heavy and fragile, before she finally spoke. "I'm not staying because of you." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed something softer. "I'll stay because I don't have anywhere else to go. But don't think for a second that I owe you anything." Daniel nodded, understanding the weight of what she was offering. Not forgiveness, not trust, but a fragile, reluctant chance. "I don't expect you to owe me anything," he said quietly. Mary held his gaze a moment longer before dropping her bag back onto the bed. The zipper remained closed, but it was clear her walls were still firmly intact. As she turned back toward the window, Daniel stepped back, letting her have the space she needed. He lingered for just a moment, watching her silhouette against the glass. The girl, who wrote like she was clinging to something unseen, her reflection a faint outline in the fading light. Downstairs, Brandon's laughter was gone, the house silent once more. Daniel left the room, his footsteps deliberately soft as he disappeared down the hallway. For the first time, he realized he wasn't sure who was cracking more, Mary or himself. The house had settled into its nightly stillness. Outside, winter pressed against the windows, a quiet reminder of a world far removed from the warmth within. Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts circling Mary, her words, her sharp edges, and the crackling silence she left in her wake. Then he heard it. At first, it was faint, barely audible through the vast emptiness of the mansion, a melody, haunting and brittle, threading its way through the stillness like a whisper. The sound grew clearer as Daniel sat up, its softness filled with an ache he couldn't place. Piano. He rose, slipping out of his room, bare feet quiet against the cold wooden floors. The notes guided him like a map down shadowed hallways and through doorways left ajar. The forgotten music room lay tucked into a wing Daniel rarely visited. A cavernous space where time felt heavier, with dust settled thick over covered furniture and grand curtains that hadn't been pulled in years. And there, in the half-light of the moon, filtering through the window, sat Mary. Her figure was small against the hulking piano, the lid cracked just enough for the fragile sound to escape. Her fingers glided over the keys, deliberate yet instinctive, as if each note lived within her, waiting to be freed. Her face, caught in the pale light, was peaceful, a stark contrast to the guarded mask she wore during the day. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, unwilling to break the spell. This version of Mary, so still, so open, felt like stumbling upon something sacred. The melody shifted, and one note fell flat. Mary's fingers hovered above the keys for a moment before pressing down again, the thud of the broken key breaking the music's delicate thread. She stopped, abruptly, her back stiffening. "I know you're there," she said, her voice piercing the air like glass. Daniel stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath him. "I wasn't trying to hide." Mary turned slightly, her profile sharp against the shadows. Her hands rested motionless in her lap, the piano now as silent as the room around them. "You play," Daniel said softly, though it wasn't a question. "It's just an old habit." Her voice was defensive, but something about the way her hands lingered on the keys betrayed her. Daniel took another step forward, his gaze fixed on her. "No one plays like that unless it means something." Mary's shoulders tensed. For a moment, she looked as though she might get up and leave, but instead, she turned back to the piano, her fingertips grazing the worn ivory keys. "My father taught me," she said finally, the words clipped, forced, as though dragged from someplace she didn't want to visit. Daniel blinked, surprised, not just by the admission, but by the quiet weight in her voice. "Your father." She nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the piano. "He loved music, said it was the one thing that could keep the world from swallowing you whole." She paused, fingers tracing patterns across the keys without pressing down. "We had an old upright piano in our living room. He played every night, and I sat beside him. Sometimes he let me play too." The room fell quiet again, save for the faint howl of wind against the windows. Daniel observed her intently, perceiving her delicate balance. "What happened to him?" he asked gently. Mary's hands froze. She closed the lid of the piano with the same deliberate care she gave to everything, slow and measured, as though sealing something away. "I lost him," she said quietly, her voice devoid of the anger that often colored her words. "I ended up in an orphanage after that. I think they tried to look for him, but..." People stopped looking after a while. Her voice grew tighter, each word carefully measured. "I stayed there until I was old enough to leave. By then it didn't matter anymore." Daniel swallowed, unsure of how to respond. Mary stood, her notebook now clutched tightly against her chest, as though shielding herself with its weight. Her expression was calm, but her eyes, those guarded, unreachable eyes, held a flicker of something raw. "You didn't have to stop," Daniel said after a beat. Mary's lips twitched, just faintly, but it wasn't quite a smile. "It doesn't sound right anymore." It sounded perfect. Mary met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You should go back to bed, Daniel. It's late." She moved past him toward the door, her steps quiet, but purposeful. Daniel remained in the room for a long moment after she left, staring at the piano. Its broken key, the dust gathered along its edges, the echo of a song that lingered somewhere in the corners of the air. For the first time, he understood why Mary avoided leaving traces of herself. Every part of her was carefully held together, like a melody played on fragile keys. Any touch too hard might shatter the sound entirely. But still, he thought, as he ran his fingers across the piano's cold surface, she had played. And that, perhaps, was a beginning. The mansion felt different after that night, though neither of them spoke of it. Daniel noticed how Mary moved through the house now, still quiet, still guarded. But something had shifted. She no longer flinched when he passed her in the hallway, no longer kept her gaze glued to the floor. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it wasn't indifference either. One evening, Daniel found her at the dining table, a plate of food in front of her. She wasn't eating, just moving the fork absently across the ceramic, staring at nothing. "Join me," Daniel said, stepping into the room. He kept his voice light and casual, as though she might bolt if he pressed too hard. Mary hesitated, but didn't refuse. "I already ate." "Then sit." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, setting a bowl of soup in front of himself. They ate in silence at first, the faint ticking of the dining room clock stretching out between them. Mary still avoided his gaze, her focus on the worn notebook beside her plate. It was a wall she seemed to carry everywhere. "Do you ever stop writing?" Daniel asked eventually, his tone more curious than critical. Her fork paused mid-air before she set it down. "No." "Why?" Mary glanced up briefly, her expression inscrutable. "Because when you're invisible, no one else tells your story." Daniel stilled, her words leaving a heavier silence behind them. He didn't press further. Instead, he changed the subject. "You go into town a lot." Mary shrugged. "It's better than staying here all day." "Tomorrow, I'll come with you." Her head snapped up, eyes narrowing slightly. "Why?" "Why not?" Daniel countered, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. I could use the walk. Mary's expression softened to something resembling resignation. Suit yourself. The next afternoon, they walked side by side down a winding road into the small town at the edge of the estate. Daniel's coat was pressed and expensive, his shoes polished against the grit of the pavement. Beside him, Mary carried herself with an effortless simplicity, worn boots, an old scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She didn't seem to care what anyone thought. It struck Daniel as strange how comfortable she looked here, in the world that felt so far removed from his own. "Where do you go when you're in town?" Daniel asked after a long stretch of silence. "Here and there." Mary didn't elaborate, her gaze forward. They passed a small Christmas shop with frost-covered windows and garlands draped across its doorway. Daniel stopped, eyeing the display of ornaments twinkling under warm lights. "I want to decorate the house," he said suddenly. Mary turned to him, brow arched. "Why?" Daniel stared at the display, hands deep in his coat pockets. "Christmas is coming soon." The words came out hollow, as if he were reminding himself of the fact. Mary regarded him for a moment, before shaking her head faintly. "You don't seem like someone who cares about holidays." Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he pushed open the shop door, a bell chiming overhead. Mary followed reluctantly, her expression dubious. Inside, the shop smelled of cinnamon and pine. Decorations in red and gold hung from every corner. Lights, wreaths, wooden angels carved with delicate hands. Daniel picked up a small glass ornament, holding it up to the light. "When I was a kid, my mother used to go overboard with this stuff," he said absently, almost to himself. "She said a house without decorations was a house without a soul." Mary didn't reply, but when Daniel glanced at her, she was watching him. Not with pity, but something else. Understanding, maybe. "Will you help me pick some out?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Why?" Daniel hesitated. He didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did, and he didn't want to say it aloud. That Christmas was coming, and with it, the end of their arrangement. The house would be quiet again. Empty. Mary looked at him for a beat longer before she sighed. Fine. The walk back was quieter, weighed down by bags of decorations neither of them would admit to caring about. Mary followed reluctantly, her expression dubious. Inside, the shop smelled of cinnamon and pine. As they neared the edge of town, Mary stopped suddenly, her gaze focused on a small group huddled near a church entrance. Daniel followed her line of sight and saw them, homeless men and women, wrapped in mismatched blankets, sharing the remnants of a loaf of bread. Mary approached them without hesitation. The group turned at the sound of her footsteps, and Daniel noticed how their expressions softened. There was no shame in their eyes, no begging. They looked at Mary with respect, as though she were one of them, and something more. "Mary," one of the men greeted, his voice rough but kind. She smiled faintly, crouching beside him. "How are you doing, Dan?" "Better now." He nodded toward the food she'd left earlier, tucked neatly beside him. "You keep us going, you know." "Someone has to," Mary replied quietly. Daniel stood a few feet back, watching. He had expected her to look small here, fragile, but instead, Mary seemed to expand, her presence filling the space in a way he hadn't seen before. There was no pity in her gestures, no condescension in her voice. She moved like she belonged, like she was trusted. When she returned to his side, Daniel couldn't stop himself from asking, "You help them?" Mary shrugged, but her voice was steady. "I know what it's like to have nothing." Daniel didn't respond. As they walked back to the mansion, his mind replayed the scene. Her quiet authority, her ease among people he had spent his whole life avoiding. It unsettled him. There was more to Mary than he'd ever imagined. And for the first time, Daniel wondered what he could offer her in return. The final weeks of the year pressed against Daniel like a vice, meetings, contracts, and decisions that demanded his attention all at once. The work of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. Though he excelled at navigating deals and negotiations, something tugged at the edges of his mind. Mary, her presence quietly weaving into the fabric of his days. Each evening when he returned to the mansion, she was there, not waiting for him, but existing in the background like part of the house itself. In the mornings, he would see her in the garden, sitting by the ivy-clad bench, writing in her notebook as though she carried the weight of the world on fragile pages. At first, he'd tried not to think about it. Now, it felt impossible to ignore. That afternoon, Daniel leaned back in his office chair, scanning the spreadsheets before him with mild disinterest. Financial projections sprawled across the screen in neat, sterile rows. But the numbers seemed meaningless today. The door opened softly, and Walter Hughes stepped in, clutching a leather-bound folder. Walter was a man who moved without wasted energy, deliberate, quiet, and steady. His grey hair was neatly combed, his suit crisp, though his face carried the weight of years. Deep lines framed his mouth, and his eyes, an unusual pale blue, held a kind of lingering sadness, as though haunted by something only he could see. "Walter," Daniel greeted, grateful for the interruption. "Come in." Walter approached the desk, his steps soundless over the thick carpet. "I've finalized the acquisition projections for next quarter," he said, placing the folder down. "The numbers are strong, but there's a slight fluctuation in the second phase. I've outlined contingencies." Daniel took the folder, flipping it open with one hand. He glanced briefly at the clean columns of figures before nodding. "You're thorough, as always." Walter offered the faintest of smiles, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That's what you pay me for." Daniel leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, snow flurried gently against the glass, the garden below already blanketed in white. He could just make out Mary's small figure wandering the grounds, her coat pulled tightly around her. "Daniel," Walter's voice pulled him back. I said, do you want me to attend tomorrow's meeting with the auditors?" Daniel rubbed his jaw absent-mindedly. "Yeah, I'll need you there." Walter nodded. He lingered for a moment, his gaze narrowing slightly as he studied Daniel, reading him in that way he always seemed to. "You look distracted." Daniel looked up sharply, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Just a lot on my plate right now." Walter accepted the answer with a quiet hum, though his pale eyes lingered for a beat longer than necessary. As he turned to leave, Daniel's phone buzzed on the desk. He picked it up instinctively. "Yeah?" There was a pause on the other end before he spoke again, his voice softening slightly. "Mary, are you at the house?" From the doorway, Walter froze. The sound of the name struck him like an invisible blow, small, almost inconsequential, yet it sent ripples through him. Daniel's words blurred after that, some passing mention of dinner and a forgotten appointment. Walter didn't hear them. He stood unmoving, his hand tightening faintly against the chair's edge. Mary. The name sat heavy in his chest, a name he hadn't allowed himself to say aloud in years. For a moment, he was somewhere else entirely. The distant sound of piano notes, a little girl's laughter filling a too-small room, her fingers pressing clumsily over worn keys. Walter drew a slow, measured breath, forcing the memory back where it belonged. When Daniel hung up, he turned to find Walter watching him, still calm, still composed, but his shoulders seemed slightly stiffer now. "Something wrong?" Daniel asked. Walter's mouth opened as if to say something, but he hesitated. He shook his head faintly, his voice smooth when he finally spoke. "No, nothing at all." Daniel nodded, distracted, and returned to the file. Walter stepped out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. In the empty hallway, Walter leaned a hand against the wall, steadying himself. The air felt heavier suddenly, harder to breathe. Mary. Memories long buried began to surface. Fragments of a little girl with curious eyes and small hands that loved to trace piano keys, of fires that swallowed orphanages whole, leaving no answers, only ash. Just miles away, unaware of his turmoil, Mary sat alone by the frozen fountain in the garden. She stared down at her notebook, pen poised above blank pages, as though searching for words that refused to come. The snow fell softly around her, settling on her coat and in her hair, but she didn't seem to notice. Walter Hughes's shadow lingered closer than she knew. Daniel couldn't explain why he did it. Perhaps it was the silence of the house, or the way Mary's presence felt like both a constant and an absence. That evening, he decided to host a dinner. Nothing extravagant, nothing overwhelming, just him and her. Two strangers in a house that no longer felt entirely his. He set the table himself, dismissing the staff for the evening. The dining room, usually grand and cavernous, felt quieter in the candlelight. The flames flickered against the crystal glasses and untouched silverware. When Mary appeared, Daniel looked up. Her hair fell loosely over her shoulders, her clothes still simple but somehow softened. Her eyes flickered to the table before narrowing slightly. "What's this?" "A dinner," Daniel said, pouring water into a glass. "I figured we might as well eat in the same room for once." Mary hesitated at the doorway. "You didn't need to do this." "I wanted to." Reluctantly, she stepped forward and sank into a chair across from him. The room fell into a tentative quiet as Daniel handed her a dish of roasted vegetables. "I didn't know what you'd like." "It's fine," she said quickly. She took the smallest portion and began to eat, her movements cautious and deliberate. For a while, the only sound was the soft clink of cutlery against porcelain. Mary's shoulders were rigid, her guard firmly in place, but Daniel resisted the urge to fill the silence. Instead, he ate, watching her from across the table, noticing the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when it fell into her face, or how she avoided his gaze entirely. Finally, he spoke. "Why do you always write?" Mary's fork paused mid-air before she set it down. "Why do you always ask questions?" "Habit," he said lightly. "And curiosity." She didn't respond, her fingers resting against the edge of the table. Her notebook, as always, was close, tucked beside her on the chair. Daniel leaned back, tilting his head. "You know, you're not what I expected." Mary looked up, her expression cautious. "What did you expect?" Daniel hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I don't know. Someone angrier, maybe. Someone who'd scream at me every day for being an idiot." "You are an idiot," Mary replied flatly, though there was no heat in her voice. He laughed quietly, and for the first time, she looked at him properly. Her gaze softened, just slightly. "Why are you doing this?" Mary asked after a beat, her tone quieter now. "Why the dinner? The decorations, the questions?" Daniel stared at her, the answer bubbling to the surface before he could stop it. "Because the bet doesn't matter anymore." Her posture stiffened. "What?" Daniel leaned forward, his voice softer but steady. "It doesn't matter, Mary. I don't care about the stupid bet. I haven't cared for weeks." Mary's eyes darkened, her shoulders rising defensively. "So what's this now, another game?" "No." He shook his head firmly. "It's not a game." Her breath hitched slightly, though she tried to hide it. "Don't do this, Daniel." "I'm not doing anything. I just..." He paused, his words catching in his throat. "I care about you, Mary. That's the truth." For a moment, the room was still. Mary stared at him, her hands curling into fists in her lap. Her expression was unreadable, yet her silence conveyed a powerful message. Abruptly, she pushed her chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. "I can't," she muttered, turning away. "Mary, I said I can't." Her voice cracked, and Daniel froze, his chest tightening as she fled the room. Daniel found her hours later in the music room. The broken piano sat silent, but Mary was curled up on the bench, her arms wrapped around herself. She didn't look at him when he entered, her voice low and hoarse. "I never told you about my father," she said suddenly. Daniel stopped, watching her carefully. "You don't have to." "I want to," she whispered. Her eyes, when they met his, were red-rimmed but steady. "He was a good man, honest, brave. He worked hard for everything we had, and he never took shortcuts. He taught me to play the piano, because he said music could give us something no one else could take away." Daniel stayed silent, letting her continue. He was too honest, though. He spoke up about people who did the wrong thing, and they ruined him for it. Her voice trembled, her words sharp-edged and raw. He disappeared one day, just gone. I waited for him to come back, but he never did. I ended up in an orphanage after that. And then... She stopped, her breath catching. "And then?" Daniel asked gently. Mary nodded, her chin trembling as tears spilled down her cheeks. "The fire. I lost everything. I lost the place where he might have found me. I lost any hope of seeing him again." Daniel crossed the room carefully, kneeling beside the bench. "Mary." She flinched slightly when he reached out, but he didn't pull away. Slowly, he rested his hand on hers, his touch warm and grounding. "You don't have to carry this alone." She shook her head fiercely, tears dripping onto the piano keys. "I don't want your pity." "It's not pity." His voice was steady. "It's just me, standing here, listening." Mary looked at him then, really looked at him, and for once her walls cracked just enough for the light to seep through. Her sobs came quietly, broken and uneven, and Daniel stayed beside her, his hand never leaving hers. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence. Inside the music room, Mary cried for the father she lost, the years stolen, and the loneliness that had become her only companion. Daniel stayed, and for the first time, neither of them felt alone. The mansion was alive with movement, light spilling from every window as soft strains of holiday music wove through the halls. Guests arrived in droves, men in pressed suits, women in shimmering dresses, chattering brightly as the grand Christmas party unfolded. Daniel stood at the foot of the staircase, fastening the last button of his jacket. His nerves, something he wasn't used to, pulled at him as he glanced upward. Mary had refused at first, predictably stubborn, but he'd spent the better part of the afternoon convincing her to stand beside him tonight. "Just one evening," he had said, hands shoved into his pockets. "It's important." "I don't belong there, Daniel." Her voice had been firm, but quiet, layered with something deeper. "You do to me," he had replied, softer this time. Eventually she relented, though her acceptance came with a begrudging sigh. Now, Daniel waited. And when Mary appeared at the top of the stairs, the soft murmur of the party seemed to blur into static. She wore a simple black dress, modest yet elegant, that skimmed just below her knees. Her hair, usually swept carelessly around her shoulders, fell in soft waves down her back. She still looked like herself, grounded sharp, but there was something gentler in the way she held herself tonight. Mary paused as her eyes met his, searching for judgment or pity in his expression. She found none. "You look beautiful," Daniel said simply. Mary's lips twitched faintly, but she quickly averted her gaze, descending the steps with measured steps. "This doesn't change anything." Daniel chuckled softly. "Wouldn't expect it to." Together, they moved through the sprawling room, Daniel greeting guests and associates, while Mary kept close by his side. She spoke little, her demeanor cool but polite. Yet Daniel noticed the way people stole curious glances in her direction. In a room full of open books, she exuded an enigma, and she wore it well. Walter Hughes stood near the grand windows, his hands wrapped around a glass of scotch he hadn't touched. The party swirled around him, bright laughter, the clink of glasses. But Walter seemed set apart from it all, his pale blue eyes drifting absently across the room. And then he saw her. It was like the air was punched from his lungs. Mary. Walter froze, his glass trembling faintly as his grip faltered. For a moment he thought his mind was playing a cruel trick, an illusion born of too many restless nights, too many buried regrets. But no, she was there. She stood beside Daniel Montgomery, half turned toward him, her chin slightly raised in that quiet, defiant way he remembered so well. Her hair fell differently now, and her features were older, sharper, but it was her. It had to be her. His vision tunneled, the noise of the party fading to a muffled hum. Walter's breath came in shallow bursts as memories crashed over him. A tiny hand reaching for piano keys, the sound of her laughter, the day he lost her. Mary turned slightly, catching the weight of someone's stare. Her gaze met Walter's, her brow furrowed just faintly, as though recognizing something familiar she couldn't place. Then realization struck. Her expression shifted, first confusion, then disbelief, as her eyes widened and her face paled. Walter took an unsteady step forward, his drink forgotten. "Mary," he whispered, though no sound carried across the room. Mary stared at him, frozen in place. Her lips parted, but no words came. Daniel noticed. He turned toward her, following her gaze across the room until he saw Walter, now standing stock still, his face stricken with an emotion Daniel couldn't name. Mary's hands trembled at her sides. Her voice, when it came, was small and broken. "Cha?" The word shattered something in the space between them. Walter's face crumpled as he exhaled sharply, the glass slipping from his fingers and shattering against the marble floor. Heads turned, the room falling into a hush, but Walter didn't seem to notice. He moved forward, his steps slow, almost hesitant, as if afraid she might disappear if he reached her too quickly. Mary didn't move. Her breathing came in uneven gasps as tears welled in her eyes. When Walter finally reached her, his hands trembled as they lifted to cup her face, cradling her cheeks as if to assure himself she was real. "Mary," he choked out, his voice breaking. "My little girl. It's you." Her tears spilled freely now, streaking down her face as her own hands lifted to cover his, her touch just as shaky. "Cha." The word broke in half, a sob catching in her throat. Walter pulled her into his arms then, holding her tightly, as though afraid she might slip away again. Mary clung to him, her face buried in his shoulder, her body trembling against his. From across the room, Daniel stood frozen. A lump rose in his throat as he watched the scene unfold, his chest tightening with something he couldn't fully name, relief, joy, and a strange ache he didn't expect. The party around them fell away. The whispers, the curious glances, none of it mattered. There, in the middle of the grand Christmas celebration, a family found each other again. Walter whispered words into Mary's hair, fragments of apologies, of disbelief, of love, and she cried, letting years of loneliness and pain pour out of her. Daniel took a step back, giving them the space they needed. He turned slightly, his eyes drifting to the towering Christmas tree in the center of the room, its lights glowing softly like stars. For the first time in years, the house felt full, alive. And Daniel realized with quiet certainty that this was the moment everything changed. The grand Christmas party should have felt like a celebration. The lights glowed warmly against the massive tree in the center of the room, and the air buzzed with renewed life after Walter and Mary's emotional reunion. People whispered softly, stealing glances at the father and daughter embracing near the window, but no one dared interrupt. Daniel stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold, a mix of joy and quiet pride settling in his chest. They deserved this. After everything Mary had endured, after everything Walter had lost, it felt as though time had finally begun to heal the fractures. Mary wiped her tears and smiled faintly at her father. It was small, but real, a glimpse of the girl she must have been before life had stolen so much from her. Daniel, from his corner, felt something shift inside him, something permanent. And then Brandon walked in. The sharp sound of his laughter preceded him like a blade cutting through the warmth of the room. Well, well, isn't this a touching little scene? Daniel's head snapped up, his entire body tensing as Brandon sauntered toward the center of the room, glass in hand. He looked around, as if searching for someone to join his amusement, but no one laughed. They were watching in uneasy silence. "Brandon," Daniel said coolly, stepping forward. "Not now." Brandon ignored him, his gaze shifting between Mary and Walter before landing squarely on Daniel. "You really have been busy, haven't you? Hosting charity cases, playing knight in shining armor. It's almost sweet." "Stop." Daniel's voice was sharper this time, low and dangerous. Mary turned to look at Brandon, her face carefully blank, though Daniel could see the way her hands curled tightly at her sides. Walter stepped closer to her, his eyes narrowing protectively. Brandon smirked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Tell me something, Daniel. Do you even remember how this all started? Or has your little act of gallantry erased the part where you made a bet to marry her for Christmas?" The room froze. The whispers, the glances, all of it seemed to sharpen into a singular, cutting silence. As Brandon's words lingered in the air, Daniel felt his pulse pound. He looked toward Mary, who was staring at him now, her expression unreadable, but her shoulders rigid. "Shut your mouth, Brandon." "Why?" Brandon's grin widened cruelly. "Are you afraid she might find out the truth? That you've been fooling her this whole time?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. "You've really outdone yourself, Montgomery. Falling for your own con? That's rich." Daniel stepped forward until he stood mere inches from Brandon, his voice a low growl. "Get out." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "What's the matter? Afraid the little damsel might run off now that she knows the truth?" "Enough!" Daniel's voice thundered, echoing off the walls and startling a few of the guests. The force of it silenced even Brandon's smug smile. Daniel turned to face the crowd, his gaze lingering on Mary for just a moment before he spoke, leaving the room breathless. "Yes," he said, his voice calmer now, but full of conviction. "It started as a bet. I was a fool, and I let my pride drag me into something cruel and thoughtless." He paused, his throat tight as he looked directly at Mary. "But the truth is, that bet stopped mattering a long time ago." Brandon scoffed. "Oh, please." Daniel ignored him. "I made a mistake," he continued, his voice steady. "The biggest mistake of my life. But if it hadn't happened, I never would have met her. I never would have realized how empty my world was." Mary blinked, her face still, though Daniel saw her chin tremble ever so slightly. "I don't care about the bet," Daniel said firmly. "I don't care what anyone here thinks. The only thing that matters is her. Mary." Brandon opened his mouth again, but Daniel cut him off. "You're wrong about her. She's not weak, and she's not some project to fix. She's the strongest person I've ever met. And if you can't see that, then I feel sorry for you." Daniel turned to Mary then, his voice softening. "I love you." The words carried no hesitation. "Not because of a bet, not because I feel guilty, but because you've shown me what it means to really care about someone." The room remained silent. Brandon, for once, had no words. Mary stared at Daniel, tears welling in her eyes as her breathing quickened. She lifted a hand to her face, wiping at the tears before they could fall. She didn't speak, didn't move, but something in her gaze softened, just enough for Daniel to see it. Walter, standing protectively beside her, looked from Mary to Daniel, pride flickering across his tired face. He placed a steadying hand on Mary's shoulder, as though to say, "It's all right now." "Brandon," Daniel said, turning back toward the man, his expression ice-cold. "You're done here. Leave." Brandon hesitated, his bravado faltering under the weight of the room's silence and Daniel's unrelenting stare. With a sharp scoff, he turned and walked out, his departure marked by the faint click of his shoes against the marble floor. The room exhaled, as if a collective weight had been lifted. Daniel turned back to Mary, his heart pounding. She met his gaze, open, vulnerable, in a way he hadn't seen before. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You mean that?" Daniel stepped forward, his tone gentle but resolute. "Every word." Mary's lip trembled as she let out a shaky breath, her walls finally, visibly, cracking. Walter squeezed her shoulder once more, then stepped aside, giving her the space to choose. For a moment, Mary didn't move. Then, slowly, she took a step toward Daniel, and in that fragile, perfect silence, the distance between them disappeared. The bells rang softly through the cold night air, their chimes echoing over snow-dusted rooftops and cobbled streets. Midnight had arrived. Daniel stood at the back of the small church, his breath visible in the frosty air as he pushed the heavy wooden door open. The warmth inside greeted them. Candles flickering along the aisles, golden light spilling over the worn pews, and the low hum of a choir's carol filling every corner. Walter walked ahead, his steps steady but reverent. In his right hand, he held Mary's. His fingers curled protectively around hers, as though afraid to let go. Mary moved quietly beside him, the weight of the evening visible in her gentle, unspoken hesitations. Daniel trailed behind, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, observing the reunion of father and daughter, despite all the challenges they faced. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt such peace. The church was full, yet no one noticed their arrival. People knelt in prayer or sat together, their faces calm and content. A row of candles at the front flickered with a warmth that seemed to melt away the chill of the outside world. Walter led Mary to the altar, pausing by the stand of unlit candles. He looked at her, his expression soft. "Would you like to light one?" he asked. Mary glanced at him, her lips parting slightly in surprise. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she nodded, the faintest smile touching the corner of her mouth. Walter released her hand, and Mary stepped forward, taking a thin taper from its holder. Daniel watched from a few steps away, unable to look elsewhere, as Mary carefully lit the taper from the central flame. Her hands were steady, her face bathed in the soft glow of the candlelight. She reached out, lighting one of the smaller candles, its tiny flame dancing to life. Walter, standing close beside her, picked up another taper and lit a second candle. Together, they knelt briefly, side by side, and for the first time, Mary's shoulders seemed to relax, her walls falling away in the stillness of the moment. Daniel took a slow breath as he approached, standing just behind her. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and took out a small box. Inside lay the pendant, a delicate silver charm in the shape of a piano, its craftsmanship simple yet precise. It gleamed faintly under the warm light of the church. "Here," Daniel said softly. Mary turned, looking up at him in surprise. He extended the pendant toward her, holding it in his palm. She didn't take it at first, her eyes flickering between the pendant and Daniel's face, searching for some hidden meaning. "It's for you," he said, his voice low but certain. "It reminded me of you, of the music, of everything you've held on to all this time." Mary's lips parted slightly as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the pendant. She held it carefully, as though afraid it might break. "Daniel," he smiled faintly, "you don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to have it." Mary looked down at the charm, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's perfect," she whispered. Walter, standing quietly to the side, watched the exchange with pride written across his face. He stepped forward and rested a hand on Mary's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "It's been a long time since I've seen you smile like that," he said softly. Mary turned to him, blinking back tears, and managed a small, real smile. "It feels like home." Daniel glanced between them, his chest tightening at her words. The choir's carol swelled, filling the church with its melody. People rose from their seats, gathering near the altar to light their own candles, their voices joining in quiet harmony. Mary, Walter, and Daniel stood together, caught in the moment, three people who had found something they didn't know they'd been searching for. Outside, the snow fell gently, blanketing the world in white. The church bells tolled again, marking the hour as families and friends spilled out of the church, their laughter and whispers carried on the crisp night air. Daniel stood at the bottom of the steps, his coat dusted with snow, watching as Mary and Walter emerged. Walter paused at the threshold, looking back at the church for a moment before exhaling softly. The weight on his shoulders finally lifted. Mary lingered on the top step, turning her face upward toward the falling snow. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her eyes bright and alive in a way Daniel hadn't seen before. When she looked at him, her gaze held something new, something fragile, but full of hope. She smiled then, a real smile, unguarded and soft. Daniel moved toward her, slipping his arm around her shoulders with an ease that felt natural. Mary didn't pull away. She leaned into him slightly, her head resting against his shoulder as the snow fell around them. Walter joined them, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his expression one of quiet peace. He walked beside them, matching their pace as they moved toward the waiting car. No words were spoken. None were needed. Daniel tightened his arm around Mary, his silent promise clear in the gesture. "You're not alone anymore. I'll be your family. Always." As the church bells rang one last time, their sound echoed into the night, a melody of endings and beginnings, of love and forgiveness, and of a future filled with light. And for the first time in years, Mary allowed herself to believe in it. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us, and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.